Alright, it's happening. The single most requested video since I started this channel. We're talking about the Tyrants. They are the big bads of Malifaux. 13 power-hungry beings that have been the thorn in the side of everybody else for thousands of years. So let's cut right to the chase. We're going to go through each one of them, talk about their history, what we know about them, and where they are now. I'm going to touch a little bit on their background, but if you want something more in-depth, then check out this video I did on the Tyrant Wars, so you can get caught up on the history of ancient Malifaux, and where the Tyrants come from and how they got defeated the first time. Let's do it. The Fae were living in a time of prosperity. Technology was flourishing, and disease and hunger had been eradicated, but some among their number were not content. They started performing forbidden experiments and delving into dark magic, and a few, 12 to be specific, developed the ability to create life. They came to be known as the Tyrants, and their creations became known as the Nephilim. As the Tyrants' power grew, they took over parts of Malifaux, in direct opposition to the Autumn Court and the rest of the Fae. Their powers developed to a point where they were something like gods, and soon their conflict with the Fae turned to an all-out war. The Tyrant Nightmare was once a dreaming one, a group of the Fae that called Malifaux City their home. When the Tyrant War kicked off, Nightmare entered into the dreaming world, chasing down his kin and killing them. He fed on their magic, and studied the pathways between waking and sleep. By the time the war was over, the realm of dreams was turned into a place of horror, and few if any of the dreaming ones still remained. After the Tyrants were weakened by the opening of the Kythera Gate, and Titania was subsequently banished, her former allies began hunting down the Tyrants. After 2 Tyrants were successfully imprisoned, Nightmare decided to exile himself into the realm of dreams. After centuries, the Tyrant had an encounter with a strange boy. The boy had remarkably vivid dreams, and as was his habit, Nightmare started to twist them into horrible terrors. But unexpectedly, the boy was able to change the dream back, showing a level of control that rivaled Nightmare's, and secretly struck fear in the Tyrant. He became fascinated with the boy, and soon learned that he was also able to manifest himself in Malifaux, twisting reality itself, just like one of his dreams. Nightmare realized that this boy was his opportunity. If he could learn to understand his powers, he could take him as a host and use him to ascend. As a result, Nightmare follows the dreamer around, protecting the boy, and indulging him by playing horrible games. When the dreamer slept, he and Nightmare could manifest in Malifaux, giving the Tyrant the opportunity to indulge in bloodshed. When the Neverborn Civil War kicks off, Nightmare, whose true identity is not known to the Neverborn, instructs Dreamer to ally with Zoraida and Lilith in opposing Nekima and Titania. Presumably, this is because Titania has a reputation as the Tyrant Killer, and Nightmare is afraid that her return will be a threat to him. Nightmare and Dreamer participate in the battle, but Nekima strikes down her sister before they have a chance to stop her. The Tyrant chases her away, and then Dreamer returns to Zoraida's hut, where he sabotages the witch's effort to save Lilith. Zoraida decides to take her to Nythera, where she could be held in stasis to prevent the woman from dying. Nightmare carries her, and just as he releases her into the pit, he reveals a bit of his true self, and he takes pleasure in the horrified realization on Lilith's face. Plague was once an alchemist who was studying life and death and trying to gain a mastery over time. After the rise of the Tyrants, Plague spread illness that infected and killed the Fae and the true Nephilim. He thought that the disease would be cleansing to the people, an idea that they unsurprisingly resisted. As the tides began to turn and the Tyrants were trapped one by one, Plague was locked away in the necropolis, protected by a barrier of fate. Any living being who sought out his crypt would automatically be turned away. While locked in this prison, Plague was visited by Ionis, Father Time, who showed him many of the possibilities the future might bring. He explained to Plague that fate is a powerful force, but it can be overcome with a more powerful force of will. He also explains to Plague that just because he was not killed in the past does not mean that he cannot be killed in the future, and one of the eventual futures that he shows him has the grave spirit floating in the sky over Malifaux. When the humans return to Malifaux City, they begin exploring and spreading out, though luckily the wards keep them away from Plague's prison. That was until the ratcatcher Hamlin accidentally falls into a hole in the sewers caused by an explosion, and ends up washed into the necropolis, releasing Plague from his prison. He devours the man in a sea of pests, and then takes on his physical form. The Tyrant quickly began spreading the plague around Malifaux City, gaining power from the deaths it caused, and gathering new followers by playing songs on his flute. Once he had accumulated enough power, Plague took the intricate mechanical box that had laid with him in his crypt, and went looking for the key. He and his followers attacked an observatory in the quarantine zone, where they found a girl named Karai, who was in possession of a ring with green gems. Plague took the ring and inserted it into the box, and then looked outside as the red cage, the prison that held the tyrant Sharufe, began to descend. It crashed into the bayou, unleashing a huge wave of etheric energy that Hamlin intended to absorb in order to fully ascend. But before he could accomplish this, Karai's ghostly alter ego, Ikirio, attacked him, removing the ring from the box before the ceremony could be completed. As Ikirio tried to finish him off, the observatory self-destructed. Never one to learn from his own mistakes, Plague soon decided to go with Plan A once again. After regaining a physical form, Plague returned to the rubble of the observatory and found the remains of the box. He then tasked one of his followers with rebuilding the contraption. However, a Torakage named Toshiko, who had been working for Misaki, discovered his plan with the help of some neighborhood kids who had hidden away from his influence. She takes away the mechanisms of the box, leaving him with nothing but a decoy full of dead rats and stones. Years later, and most of the rest of the outcasts have moved into a compound in the Badlands called Freehold. Plague sends them a message, demanding that they bring him the head of the Queen, as Titania is a threat to all tyrants. Von Schill and the rest of the outcasts refused to cooperate, though they had their own plans to kill Titania, and instead they set a trap for Hamlin. When he arrived at what seemed to be a disease-ridden outpost, the Freecorpsmen came out in force, turning their guns on him. Plague then reveals his hand, as waves of stolen children and rats begin flooding out of the Freecorps supply crates. They retreat into a nearby cave, and Plague follows them until he's confronted by Tara. The two clash, but it turns out to all be a trap, and a Talos machine steps out of the darkness and ensnares the tyrant. Plague once again finds himself imprisoned, unable to escape like a rat in a trap. He struggles against the bindings, and soon finds that he can tear off a bit of his power, like an animal gnawing off a leg, weakening the tyrant, but allowing him to escape. Before the days of the Tyrants, the Gorgon was a diplomat and politician. But she dug deeper and deeper into magical lore, casting enchantments on her own body, and she became capable of enthralling anyone with just a glance. During the Tyrant War, the Gorgon took a more subtle approach, using her stealth and cunning, and manipulating the other tyrants from the shadows. When the Kytherian Council started taking down tyrants, they crafted the Gorgon's whispers into a prison made out of a soulstone. The soulstone reflected her gaze back at herself, causing her own powers to weaken her mind, and trapping her there for eons. This fist-sized green soulstone became known as the Gorgon's Tear, and it was eventually hidden away in the bayou so that the Gorgon could never return. During the first breach opening, the Gorgon's Tear was discovered, and it was reshaped in order to enhance its unique appearance. This modification changed the delicate balance of refraction that caused the Gorgon's power to be reflected onto her, and she slowly began regaining her consciousness. The Gorgon's Tear was brought back to Earth, where it developed a reputation for being cursed, because every one of its owners came to some sort of ghastly end. Eventually, it made its way back to Malifaux, where Governor General Kitchener donated it to the Malifaux Museum of Natural History. There it sat until the serial killer Seamus broke in and stole it. The Gorgon's influence was used to resurrect Molly, giving her an unusual amount of autonomy, and the tyrant helped them both when they arrived at Kythera, whispering the secret words that would open the gate and allow the Grave Spirit to enter the world. When Plague attempted to ascend by lowering the red cage, he was unaware that the Gorgon had influenced Karai, giving her the ability to call upon and control ghosts. Using this power, the Ikirio stopped Plague, presumably furthering the Gorgon's mysterious ambitions in some way. When Seamus was shot in the head during a confrontation with Samael Hopkins, Molly pushed the Gorgon's Tear into the bullet wound, bringing the Necromancer back to life. As far as we know, that's where the Gorgon's Tear still rests, giving a strange green glow to Seamus's eyes. The Tyrant December has control over the weather, and is particularly fond of blizzards and avalanches. During the Tyrant War, he terrorized the North, attracting crazy cultists who attacked the Fae and engaged in cannibalism. Any who did not join him either fell victim to the cultists, or died in avalanches, or the brutal weather. The Kytherian Council, with the help of the Nameless, bound December in the Northern Winds, a prison that he would not be able to break from himself. During the first breach opening, a group of mages left the city in the violence, and ended up near the 10 Peaks. They heard the whisper of December, who promised to share some of his power with them if they would set him free. They eventually figured out how to do so, and December turned his wrath on them, taking the most powerful as his host, and killing any who wouldn't follow him. He sensed the power emanating from the breach, and descended on the city, intending to use this power to fully ascend. The Neverborn saw this happening and tried to stop him, but his immense power proved too much for them. He would have succeeded in his plan, if not for Kenshiro appearing with the Masamune, a mythical blade infused with the power of Shazu. The swordsman struck down December's physical form, dying in the process, and December used the last of his power to fling the sword back through the breach. December then bided his time regaining his strength, until the breach opened for a second time. A convict laborer by the name of Rasputina was serving time in the north, and December reached out to her and proposed another fateful bargain. He helped her escape the guild's custody and granted her a bit of his power, and soon he convinced her to set out on a quest to fully close Kythera. She found Philip Toomber's journal, and then journeyed to the monument in the bayou, where December's plan could be completed. Though she was in the custody of the guild, she managed to close the gate, allowing December to manifest himself as a giant Wendigo. He swatted aside the guild, but soon once again came face to face with the Masamune and Shazu, this time wielded by Victoria. The woman cut him down, once again dramatically weakening the tyrant. After this, December and Rasputina struggle for control, and when the event takes place, the tyrant tries to finally fully claim her as his vessel. Rasputina is unable to resist his efforts, so she deflects his energy into a cultist named Snow. December doesn't want to take a less worthy vessel, so he pulls back, but not before Snow is tied to a physical embodiment of him, the Storm. The two continue to struggle against each other, and after being taunted by Rasputina, eventually December tries again to fully take her. She resists but feels herself fading, but realizes that December needs her, so she decides to do something drastic. She focuses her energy on her heart, causing it to explode and killing herself. December can't allow this to happen, so he reforms her body, and as she comes to, she tells him that she will ultimately win because she's willing to do whatever it takes. When the humans discover the location of Nythera, the resting place of Titania, slayer of the Tyrants, December warns Rasputina of the threat to both of them. She and her cultists travel to Nythera to try to stop the humans from breaking Titania out, but they're ultimately unsuccessful. This causes December to grant Rasputina even more of his power, hoping that they can stop Titania before she's able to destroy him for good. When the Burning Man arrived, it caused even more problems for the Tyrant. Titania was enough of a threat, but now the cultists were suffering, dwindling in numbers and reducing the Tyrant and Rasputina's power. They start resorting to creating simulacrums out of ice to bolster their numbers, and though Rasputina and December still fight for control, the Tyrant ultimately has to protect Rasputina because he needs her. Sharufe is the Tyrant of Fire, and unlike the rest of his colleagues, who are seeking power and ascension, Sharufe seems only interested in destruction. During the Tyrant War, when his people, the Awa, turned against him, he took it very personally. He destroyed their cities and their machines, almost completely wiping them out as a people, and he put a curse on all that remained, causing their flesh to decay and wither over time. Eventually, Sharufe started indiscriminately burning all of Malifaux, causing even the other tyrants to turn against him. They conspired to stop him, and used a device invented by Plague that was supposed to amplify and boost magical power, to bind him in the red cage. The Nameless forged 13 relic hammers that were used to hammer in the nails of this cage, but they still weren't satisfied that the danger was averted. They decided to hoist the red cage up into the sky, where the lack of oxygen would deprive Sharufe of his fiery magic. There he waited for centuries, until the humans returned to Malifaux, and he began subtly influencing a mage called Sonia Crid. Plague then successfully lowered the red cage, causing it to crash down into the bayou, in an attempt to capture the etheric energy and use it to ascend. His plan was foiled by Karai and the Gorgon, but Sharufe was allowed to escape, and he fled to the necropolis underneath Malifaux City. There, he continued manipulating Sonia Crid until she came to him, and he tried to take her as his vessel. She figured out what he was doing and tried to kill herself to stop him, but her companion Samael Hopkins pulled the sword out of her chest, allowing Sharufe to take control. As his power surged out from her, she may have been destroyed by the process, if not for Perdita Ortega and Hopkins managing to subdue the tyrant with a magic dampening mask. After this, Crid and Sharufe struggled for dominance, and the woman was forced to wear the mask at all times to prevent Sharufe from asserting his power. When the Governor-General executed his plan to ascend to tyranthood himself, his ritual was secretly sabotaged by the Ten Thunders. Sharufe sensed the buildup of etheric energy and tried to seize it for himself, tearing his essence away from Sonia Crid and causing her agonizing pain and disfigurement. But the sabotage to the ritual caused too much energy to build up, and instead of either the Governor-General or Sharufe fully ascending, they were fused together and created the entity known as the Burning Man. It traveled back through time and appeared over the skies of Earth, causing destruction and natural disasters everywhere it went. The Burning Man's corrupting influence caused cultists to crop up and worship him, and eventually he appeared over the skies of London. Portals to Malifaux began popping up everywhere, that led to the oceans of Malifaux, and through them poured the gibbering hordes, horrible creatures from the depths. The Battle of London saw much of the city flooded or destroyed, all under the watchful eye of the Burning Man. After Maxine and the EVS crew successfully navigated a minor breach to Malifaux, this puncture in the barrier between worlds caused the Burning Man to be sucked in. He arrived in the skies over Malifaux, bringing his characteristic destruction, raining fire down on the city, and corrupting the minds of many people. Since then, the Burning Man has been popping up on Earth and back in Malifaux, seemingly at random, as the people try to study and learn how to predict his movements, or how to counter his powers. Shazu the Warlord is the tyrant that kicked off the Tyrant War itself. As Titania and her forces were realizing what a threat the tyrants were going to be, she began mobilizing her forces when Shazu struck. He completely destroyed the city of Sancor Sid on the southeast coast of the continent, destroying thousands in one fell motion. The other tyrants rose up themselves, and Shazu personally faced down entire armies, feeding off the bloodshed and death, and causing his powers to grow. He attracted many to his banner, promising strength and dominance to any who would follow him. When the Kytherian Council rose, they began trapping the other tyrants, and they managed to starve Shazu of blood with a complex shield of wards. Many years passed after all the tyrants had either fled or been captured, but Shazu was the first to escape his prison. A Nephilim shaman wandered too close to Shazul's resting place, and the tyrant offered him a weapon in exchange for being set free. Once released, the tyrant immediately tore apart the shaman and began another rampage across Malifaux, murdering everything he came across. He had been weakened, but with every death his power grew, and some of the Nephilim, who saw opposition as futile, decided to join him. The Nephilim were powerless to stop him, and one of their broodmasters, Lorelei, knew that they couldn't defeat him conventionally. They needed to do something drastic. She sought counsel of the gigant Euripides and Valona the astronomer, and together they devised a plan and brought together 14 shamans. These shamans performed the black blood ritual, turning the red blood in their veins, which empowered Shazul when he destroyed them, into a caustic black ichor. Being starved of the blood he fed on, Shazul felt his powers weaken, and instead of risking being defeated, he used the last bit of his strength to toss himself across the dimensions, landing on Earth. He landed in Japan, causing a giant crater, and immediately did what Shazul does, taking a host and going on a rampage. The shoguns of Japan wanted to face him in battle, but it seemed to be no use, so they started looking to ancient texts to find help defeating this powerful enemy. The solution came in the form of the Masamune, a flawless blade that was imbued with powerful magic. Its wielder struck down Shazul, the sword tearing his soul from its physical form and trapping it inside of the magical blade. The sword was enshrined in Kamakura, in the hopes that the tyrant could never escape, but years later it was stolen away, and throughout the centuries there were many rumors of powerful people wielding the legendary blade. Shazul influenced the wielders of the blades, driving them to further bloodshed, and causing his powers to grow. Eventually, the sword came into possession of Kenshiro, who traveled to Malifaux during the first breach opening. When the tyrant December was released and marched on the city, Kenshiro came to face him and managed to strike down the tyrant, though he was killed in the process. December flung the sword back through the breach, as his soul was ripped from his physical form, severely weakening his powers. 100 years later, the sword was in the possession of a woman named Victoria, who was contacted by the swamp witch Zoraida and summoned to Malifaux. Zoraida knew of the Masamune's power, but was not aware that the blade contained a tyrant. She intended to have one of her doppelgangers take Victoria's place, and use the sword to stop December's plan to attain more power. But the sword gave Victoria strength, and she defeated the doppelganger, but rather than destroying it, the sword ripped out its soul, imprinting Victoria on the doppelganger, giving the creature her memories and personality. The two went to Kythera together, and when December manifested in physical form, Victoria used the Masamune to strike down the tyrant once again. The Victorias became skilled mercenaries, though the subtle influence of Shazul and the Masamune caused them to seek out more and more bloodshed. After Titania was released from Nythera, the Victorias locked themselves in the Doer's library and spent their time searching through ancient tomes. Rumors spread that Victoria would whisper to her sword, and when the two emerged, they called on other mercenaries to sign up for a dangerous job. They gathered a large group and marched into the Badlands, seeking to destroy the Fey Queen. On the journey, Victoria's bloodlust rose until she was indiscriminately cutting down her own people. She became hellbent on killing Titania, and when they finally found the queen in her forest, she rushed after the woman, sword in hand. Titania noticed her indiscriminate aggression and was easily able to avoid the woman's attacks. Then, Killjoy came to her side and disarmed Victoria, tossing the Masamune into the forest and overpowering the mercenaries. Victoria tried to go after it, obsessed with getting back her prized blade, but her sister dragged her away, insisting that they didn't really need it. After the battle, Titania's people found the sword and presented it to the queen, who immediately recognized the presence of Shazul. She enshrined the sword in a tree next to her throne, a nice trophy. 1 down, 12 to go. Obliteration was tired of existence, so during the Tyrant War, anyone who stood against him crumbled into nothing. The Tyrant had power over time itself, so his enemies simply ceased to exist. Once the Kytheran Council rose up and started trapping the Tyrants, they made several attempts to capture Obliteration, until they were finally able to secure him inside a labyrinth made of nothingness. The prison was made from Obliteration's own spiritual form, so any attempt to escape would cause him to destroy himself. After many centuries, 2 women named Tara and Karina wandered into a cave that contained the Nothing Beast, an entity that didn't really exist, but was more a lack of existence. It asked the women to travel to the labyrinth, and Karina immediately accepted, stepping through a magical door and leaving Tara alone with the beast. After a few more minutes, Tara was able to determine that the beast needed her help, and eventually agreed to step through herself. She found herself in a void, wandering through a labyrinth, and hundreds of years passed while she was simply trying to find her way. Eventually, she made it to the center of the labyrinth, where she found Karina, who had been there much longer than her, and had lost her mind. Obliteration spoke to Tara, and explained that it needed her to take a bit of himself and return to the world, and in exchange, he would grant her some of his power. Tara agreed and returned to the cave, and though she had spent many centuries in the void, and Karina had spent far longer, she found that only moments had passed in the real world. As she goes to leave, she steps outside the cave, and was immediately shot by a guild sniper. Karina brought her back to life, and now Tara acts as the herald of Obliteration, doing the tyrant's bidding in his quest to destroy the other tyrants. When Titania returned, Obliteration knew that she had to be destroyed. Tara smuggled herself into the Guild Enclave inside of a pine box, and was able to pilfer several magical artifacts out of the Guild storage room. One of these items was a polished obsidian mirror that she and Obliteration planned to use to leech away Titania's power. With the arrival of the Burning Man, the fabric of time was injured, which had dramatic effects for Obliteration and Tara. Her power over the passage of time is diminished, and even though her body is undead, it's causing her massive strain every time she uses Obliteration's power. As the Tyrants were amassing their power, but before the war started, Shazu destroyed the city of Sankor Sid. It had been inhabited by the Sirens, a group of the Fae, and the Tyrant Meridian quickly absorbed these beings into her armies, kicking off the Tyrant War proper. She then withdrew the ocean surrounding the island chain the city used to sit on, and began attacking the coast with aquatic horrors and the Sirens she forced to do her bidding. The Sirens fought back, but Meridian was cruel, breaking their minds and bodies, and forcing them to fight against their own kin. When the Kytherian Council joined up with Nameless to start imprisoning the Tyrants, their first catch was Meridian. They decided to use the Tyrants' powers against themselves, and as Meridian was the keeper of the ley lines that travel across Malifaux, her prison was constructed of those very ley lines. If she was going to escape, she would have to destroy the very thing that gave her power. As far as we know, Meridian remains trapped, though the Sirens still serve her under the sea, and some of her denizens even made it to Earth through minor breaches, including the monster Hormatangi. The gibbering hordes that invaded Earth with the arrival of the Burning Man have a connection to Meridian, and they're sometimes led by the Storm Siren, who still worships Meridian to this day. But even in Malifaux, the creatures of the oceans are getting restless, and attacks on the edges of the bayou are becoming more common, suggesting that Meridian might be up to something. During the Tyrant War, Despair used his power to instill anguish and sorrow in the minds of the people. He used this ability to tear apart societies, and to him it was all a game that he always loved to play. As the council began picking off the tyrants one by one, they crafted a puzzle box and locked Despair inside. But immediately after doing so, everyone seemed to forget about its existence. The box somehow came into the possession of a woe named Pandora, who aligned herself with Lilith of the Nephilim. Pandora started to notice that the box would whisper to her, and she even began whispering back to it. Some of her companions came out of the box, including Candy and Cade, and over time she found that it was influencing her more and more, at one point even taking control. She found herself doing things that she didn't expect, like going against her allies Zoraida and Lilith, and occasionally she would notice that she was looking up at herself from inside the box. As she continued to lose control, Despair persuaded her to attend a performance of the Crossroads 7 at the Star Theater. When she arrived, she found that Fortune, who had split himself into two forms, the woman in red and the man in black, were orchestrating a performance where the discordant music was causing the onlookers to launch into a barbaric rage. Despair took over and confronted the other tyrant, and they all clashed, resulting in the woman in red being killed, and the man in black being trapped in the box. Now, Despair mostly has control of Pandora, and she finds herself trapped in the box along with Fortune. Both prisoners struggle to take control, but for the time being, Despair has the power. During the War of the Tyrants, the dragon decided to stay out of the conflict, taking a more indirect approach. He preferred to work through his agents, and occasionally offered bits of his power to make his network of agents stronger. When the Kytherian Council began binding the Tyrants, they tried to entrap the dragon, but in response he tore himself in two, escaping their trap, and one half landed in the bayou, while the other traveled through the dimensions and landed on Earth. It landed on Mount Etna, causing a volcanic eruption that devastated the eastern Mediterranean. The dragon was weakened, and now found himself in a world with far less magical power, and so he went dormant, taking the time to regain his strength. Eventually, a shaman from Crete journeyed to Mount Etna and discovered the spectral form of the dragon. He took her as a host, and compelled her to travel east until she made it to Tibet. There, she died, and the dragon found that he couldn't leave her body, and so spent several millennia trapped in a cage. After a great deal of time, the dragon was able to jump to an Indian monk who was preparing to build a Buddhist monastery. The dragon learned about Buddhism and decided to twist it to his own needs, and using it to gather the best humans and prepare them to become a suitable host. Over the centuries, the dragon founded the 4 temples, each specializing in a different discipline, and designed to train potential vessels to be more suited to hosting the tyrant. Meanwhile, back in Malifaux, we haven't heard much from the other half of the dragon, but there is a suspicious woman in the bayou named the Black Dragon who lives among the gremlins. She's a human and doesn't seem to age, and she teaches the gremlins a strange form of magic that isn't similar to anything that the gremlin Bokors do themselves. Shenlong is the current host of the dragon half from Earthside, having been an excellent candidate due to his disciplined mind and body. But Shenlong has discovered the dragon's true intention, and has more recently begun looking for ways to free himself of his possessor. When Governor General Kitchener tried to ascend, it caused a great buildup and burst of etheric energy. The dragon tried to claim this energy for himself, and ripped himself away from Shenlong, killing the man in the process. When he realized that the power was too great, he retreated back into Shenlong, healing his body and saving them both. This incident and the subsequent arrival of the Burning Man caused the dragon to have to retreat deep into Shenlong's soul. This has given the monk the opportunity to meditate and return to studies that he had neglected long ago, all to try to arm himself for when the dragon eventually returns. Witness was one of the strangest of the tyrants, and represented justice, or as some might see it, tyranny. Her powers grew during the Tyrant War, and she was able to impose her will by using entrancing magic. Her ultimate goal seemed to be making absolute order out of the chaos. Witness was one of the tyrants that helped to weaken some of the others, but when the Kytherian Council finally turned their attention to her, she was trapped inside of a massive soulstone geode in the mountains. She spent the eons looking out from the geode, and several people sought to harness the geode's power, and may not have truly known what lurked inside of it. Damien Ravencroft was more persistent than the rest, and after finding the information in the Library of All Things, he found the geode and Witness, and now wields some of her power. The tyrant Fortune had the power to control luck, for better or worse. During the war, Fortune danced around Malifaux, handing out good luck and terrible misfortune in equal measure, but everything was to his own benefit. When the Kytherian Council rose, Fortune actually helped them in jailing Sharufe and Meridian because they both posed a threat. But before the Council could turn on Fortune, he disappeared. No one knows what he was up to for the many centuries in between, but at some point, he took on two hosts, the man in black and the woman in red. Together, they searched for a more suitable host, and set their sights on Jacob Lynch, but soon found that he had already partnered with the Hungering Darkness. So instead, they found the Crossroads Seven, a band of musicians with very little talent, if only they had a bit of luck on their side. Under the influence of Fortune, the Crossroads Seven held a concert at the Star Theater, with all of Malifaux's high society in attendance. The horrible and discordant music they played caused the onlookers to devolve into barbarity, attacking each other and ripping their friends to shreds. Soon Pandora arrived under the influence of despair, and confronted Fortune, managing to kill the woman in red, and the man in black was absorbed into her box. Now, despair has mostly taken over Pandora, and she finds herself a prisoner in the box, along with Fortune himself. They both struggle for control, but for the time being, despair seems to be winning the fight. When the Tyrants rose, there were only 12. The 13th, the Nameless, was a later addition. When the Kytherian Council was organized, they began trying to find ways to trap the Tyrants, and all of their efforts failed. Eventually, a mysterious and ancient entity came forward, offering to provide aid, as they had expertise in building machines that could contain powerful beings. Many objected to accepting their help, as Nameless seemed to have much in common with the tyrants they were trying to fight, but the council had no other choice. Nameless instructed the engineers to use the very magic the tyrants wielded to create the cages that would bind them. This would guarantee that if they were to break out of the cage, they would destroy their own power. After successfully trapping Meridian, Nameless forged 13 relic hammers, which were used to hammer in the etheric nails of the red cage that trapped Sharufe. Once all of the tyrants had either been in prison or fled, the people turned against Nameless. Her power had grown too great, making her just as bad as the tyrants she had helped them to defeat. Nameless was furious at their betrayal, and just as she was finishing up building one of her greatest machines, the people sealed her physical form away, and the last tyrant was gone. Though her location is unknown, Nameless had heralds who had helped her construct the devices that imprisoned the tyrants, and after all 13 were gone, the Neverborn entrusted these heralds with safeguarding the keys to the locks. At least some of these heralds are still around, including the mysterious creature who gave Taylor her relic hammer. And that's it for the Tyrants. It's pretty interesting because we haven't seen a few of the Tyrants come to the forefront of the plot yet. It seems like Witness is on the rise, but the Dragon, Meridian, and the Nameless are all kind of still a mystery. It also seems like Nightmare and Obliteration, and maybe Despair, could still have a shot at seizing some power, but hopefully we're going to find out in the next couple of books. Personally, I hope that we see Nameless come back and help the rest of the people defeat the Tyrants again. I kind of feel like they did her dirty back in the day. She's literally the only reason they defeated all the Tyrants the first time, and then they immediately turned on her. And she didn't even do anything horrible like Titania, who tried to bring the Grave Spirit into the world. Hashtag Nameless did nothing wrong. But anyway, tell me what you guys think, and drop a comment below, let me know who your favorite Tyrant is, and where you think their story is going to go next. If you enjoyed this video, it took me a very long time to put it together, so please leave a like, and make sure you subscribe to the channel, and consider sharing it with some folks who you think might find it interesting. If you want to support the channel, then check out the link in the description to my Patreon, because some of the patrons actually got access to this video pretty early, and there's a whole bunch of other benefits, plus you help keep the channel going. We also have a link down there to the merch store, and the weird affiliate link, so if you're going to pick up any models, then use that link. It costs you nothing, but the channel will actually get a little kickback. Huge thanks to all of the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, and Bicops Gladiator Games, and thanks for watching.